The disciples, therefore, confronted with Jesus' crucifixion and death, could only have looked forward to the resurrection at the final day, at the end of the world, and would perhaps have kept their master's tomb as a shrine where his bones might reside until the resurrection on the judgment day, when they and all the righteous dead of Israel could be reunited in the kingdom of God. But they wouldn't have come to believe the un-Jewish and outlandish idea that he was already risen from the dead. According to Professor C.F.D. Moll of Cambridge University, we have here a belief which nothing in terms of prior historical influences can account for. Professor Moll points out that we have a situation here in which a large number of people held tenaciously to this belief, which cannot be accounted for in terms of the Old Testament or the Pharisees, and that these people held on to this belief until they were finally expelled from the synagogue. Professor Moll asks, if the coming into existence of the Nazarenes, a phenomenon undeniably attested by the New Testament, rips a great hole in history, a hole the size and shape of the resurrection, what does the secular historian propose to stop it up with? The birth and rapid rise of the Christian church remain an unsolved enigma for any historian who refuses to take seriously the only explanation offered by the church itself. The mysterious X is still missing. So the question is, how then do you best explain these three independently attested facts? Taken together, these three great historical facts, the resurrection appearances, the discovery of the empty tomb, the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection, all seem to point to the historical fact of Jesus' resurrection as the most plausible explanation. But of course, there have been other explanations proffered to account for the resurrection appearances, empty tomb, and origin of the Christian faith down through history. But in the judgment of contemporary scholarship, none of these has succeeded in providing a plausible account of the facts of the case. And I think this can be seen by just a very rapid review of the principal explanations that have been offered. First, the so-called conspiracy theory. According to the conspiracy theory, the disciples stole Jesus' corpse and then lied about the resurrection appearances. This theory characterized the earliest Jewish anti-Christian polemic, as we've seen, and it was revived by the deists in the 18th century in England and then in Europe. Today, however, the theory has been universally rejected by critical scholars and survives only in sensational popular literature or in former propaganda from behind the Iron Curtain. To name just two considerations which were decisive against it, number one, it is morally impossible to indict the disciples of Jesus with such a crime. Whatever their imperfections, they were certainly good and earnest men and women and not imposters and hoaxers. No one who reads the New Testament unprejudicially can doubt that these people sincerely believed the truth of this message that they proclaimed and were willing to die for. But secondly, the theory is quite anachronistic. The conspiracy theory really cannot take seriously what a catastrophe the crucifixion was for any faith that the disciples had entertained in Jesus of Nazareth. It is guilty of looking at the crucifixion through the lenses of Christian history and belief in the resurrection rather than through the lenses of first century Palestinian Jews. Messianic movements were common in the centuries for and after Jesus, and the Romans always dealt with these messianic movements in the same way. They crucified the would-be Messiah. And when your favorite Messiah got crucified, you basically had two choices. Either you went home or you got yourself a new Messiah. But in no case do we have any movement saying that the crucified Messiah was in fact the Messiah after all, much less that God had raised him from the dead. This is simply unparalleled in Judaism. For Jewish messianic expectations, Messiah was supposed to restore the throne of David in Jerusalem and throw off the yoke of Israel's enemies, not be humiliatingly executed by them as a criminal. And the idea that Messiah was then to be raised from the dead was simply unknown in Judaism. Hence, to try to explain the empty tomb and resurrection appearances by some sort of a conspiracy theory simply seems out of the question. Secondly, the apparent death theory. According to this theory, Jesus did not really die on the cross, but he was taken down alive and placed in the tomb, where he revived and somehow escaped to convince the disciples that he had risen from the dead. This apparent death theory was championed by late 18th, early 19th century German rationalists, and unfortunately was even embraced by the father of modern theology, F.D.E. Schleiermacher. Today, however, the theory has been virtually entirely given up, and I think it's one of the virtues of Mel Gibson's movie that anyone who has seen that film and the suffering that Jesus of Nazareth endured would realize the patent absurdity of the apparent death theory. To name just a couple of points against it, number one, it would have been virtually medically impossible for Jesus to have survived the rigors of his torture and crucifixion, much less not to have died almost immediately of exposure when placed in the tomb. But secondly, the theory is explanatorily deficient in any case, since a half-dead Jesus, bleeding from open wounds and desperately in need of bandaging and medical attention, would hardly have elicited in the disciples the worship of him as the risen Lord and the conqueror of death. And these reasons alone, I think, make the apparent death theory untenable. A third theory was the hallucination theory. According to this theory, the disciples projected hallucinations of Jesus after his death, from which they mistakenly inferred his resurrection. The hallucination theory became popular during the 19th century and carried over into the first part of the 20th century as well. But again, there are good grounds for rejecting this hypothesis. First of all, it is psychologically implausible to posit such a chain of hallucinations. Hallucinations are usually associated with either mental illness or substance abuse. But in the disciples' case, the prior psychobiological preparation appears to be lacking. The disciples had no expectation of seeing Jesus alive again. All they could do would be wait until the resurrection at the end of the world to be reunited with him in the kingdom of God. There were no grounds leading them to hallucinate Jesus alive from the dead. And the frequency and the variety of the circumstances belie the hallucination theory. There is nothing in the case books of hallucinatory experiences in psychology parallel to the resurrection appearances. Jesus was not seen merely once, but many times, not just by one person, but by many persons, not just by individuals, but by groups of people, not just at one locale and under one circumstance, but at many different locales and under a variety of circumstances, not by believers only, but also by skeptics, unbelievers, and even enemies. The hallucination hypothesis simply can't be stretched to accommodate this kind of diversity. Secondly, hallucinations, if they had occurred, would not have, in any case, led to belief in Jesus' resurrection. You see, as projections of your own mind, hallucinations cannot contain anything that is not already in your mind. But we've seen that the Jewish conception of resurrection from the dead differed from Jesus' resurrection in two fundamental respects. Given their typical Jewish frame of thought, the disciples, were they to hallucinate visions of Jesus, would have projected visions of Jesus glorified in Abraham's bosom, in paradise, where the Jews believed the righteous dead went to await the resurrection at the end of the world. And thus hallucinations would not have elicited belief in Jesus' resurrection, which ran solidly contrary to modes of Jewish thinking, but at most would have led to belief that Jesus had been assumed or translated into heaven, whence he appeared to them, on the model of certain Old Testament figures like Enoch and Elijah. And thus the hallucination hypothesis is simply explanatorily inadequate when it comes to the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Finally, number 3, nor can hallucinations account for the explanation of all of the evidence. They're offered as an explanation of the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. But you see, they leave the empty tomb of Jesus unexplained, and therefore they fail as a complete and satisfactory answer. In order to explain the full range of the evidence, you have to conjoin to the hallucination hypothesis an independent hypothesis in order to explain away the empty tomb. By contrast, the resurrection hypothesis has a broader explanatory scope and is therefore a preferable explanation. Thus, none of the previous counter-explanations have succeeded in explaining the evidence as plausibly as the resurrection hypothesis itself. Now, this puts the skeptical critic in a somewhat desperate situation. To illustrate, a few years ago, I had a debate at the University of California, Irvine, on the resurrection of Jesus with a professor who had written his doctoral dissertation on the evidence for the resurrection. Now, he was thoroughly familiar with the evidence, and he could not deny the facts of the post-mortem appearances, the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb, or the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. And so his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of these 3 facts. And so he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an unknown identical twin brother who was separated from him at birth, unknown to Mary and Joseph, who came back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion, stole Jesus' body out of the tomb, and presented himself alive to the disciples who mistakenly inferred that Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, I'm not going to go into how I went about refuting this theory, but I think that it's illustrative because it shows to what desperate lengths skepticism must go in order to explain away the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. You might say to me then, well, what do skeptical scholars say to explain the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, and the origin of the Christian faith? Well, as a matter of fact, they don't say anything. Modern scholarship recognizes no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these 3 facts. Those who refuse to accept the resurrection as a fact of history are simply self-confessedly left with no explanation at all. So in conclusion then, these 3 independently established facts, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, the discovery of his empty tomb, the very origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection, all seem to point unavoidably to one marvelous conclusion, that God raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. Today, I think the rational man can hardly be blamed if he believes that on that first Easter morning, a divine miracle has occurred.
There it goes. Okay, thank you for that presentation, Dr. Craig. We're now going to open up the room for questions. And so just to reinforce, try to keep your questions straightforward and as questions. And you're going to need to use the mic because we are filming it. And if you could just be brief and direct them towards Dr. Craig.
Question here.
You mentioned John Dominic Crossan, and he apparently believes in some sort of a resurrection. But my understanding that he denies a physical bodily resurrection. And I wondered if you could elaborate on what type of resurrection he is in fact positing, and then comment on how that type of resurrection cannot be squared with orthodoxy.
Thank you for the question. Can you hear me? Is this mic working? All right. Thank you for the question. I've dialogued personally with John Dominic Crossan on this, and our dialogue's been published in the form of a little book called Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up? So if you would like to look at that further, I commend it to you. One of the frustrations that I have with modern theologians is the theological double talk that they engage in. My philosopher friends who are atheists are straight up with you. They don't believe in God. They say so. They don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. They say it didn't happen. But modern theologians are disingenuous to the point of duplicity, I think. I know that's harsh, but I think it's true. They use these words, but so evacuate them of any meaning that, in fact, they don't really believe in the affirmations that they state. For example, you're absolutely right that Crossan will say things like, I believe in the resurrection of Jesus, and so forth. But he really doesn't. His view is that after the crucifixion, the body of Jesus was taken down, probably by the Roman soldiers, and simply thrown into a shallow dirt grave reserved for criminals, where it either rotted away or was dug up and eaten by wild dogs. And nothing happened to the corpse of Jesus in terms of it coming back to life or any such thing. For Crossan, the resurrection of Jesus means that the earliest disciples or Christian community, when they met together in worship, sensed the presence of Jesus with them. They sensed that somehow he was there in spirit. And they expressed this by saying, he is risen from the dead. So that they used language that was, frankly, it was totally un-Jewish. I mean, this is not the way a Jew would speak, but this is what Crossan thinks, is that they expressed their feeling of Jesus' presence by saying he is risen from the dead, and that's how belief in Jesus' resurrection originated. It really originally didn't mean anything happened to the corpse that was thrown in the ground. It just meant that Jesus' spiritual presence continued on with the disciples. But Crossan himself doesn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus in any literal sense of the word or in any Jewish sense of the word. A Jew, as I indicated in the talk, would not say anything of that sort that these modern theologians say. They would say he didn't rise from the dead, but his memory continues on, or we remember Jesus or something, but not that he was raised from the dead. And the reason that Crossan doesn't believe in these events as events of history is because he rejects the possibility of miracles. He doesn't believe in a personal God who can intervene in history and do things that the laws of nature themselves cannot accomplish. I think the key moment in our dialogue that I referred to came when, during the discussion time, during the Q&A, I said to Crossan, on your view, did God exist during the Jurassic Age when no human beings were around? And he said, that's a meaningless question. And I said, no, surely that's a meaningful question. During the Jurassic period, when there were no human beings alive, was there a being who was the creator and the sustainer of the universe? And he said, well, I guess I would have to say no. Well, what became very obvious is that for Crossan, God is just sort of an interpretive framework that the individual believer puts on reality. But there isn't any objective, mind-independent entity out there who is the creator and sustainer of the universe. He didn't exist when there were no human beings because he is an imaginative or interpretive construct of believers, the way they view reality and put it on the universe. So in fact, Crossan is an atheist. He's literally an atheist. He doesn't believe that God exists, and therefore miracles are impossible, and therefore things like the resurrection, the virgin birth, the miracles of Jesus go out the window before you even sit down at the table to look at the evidence. So the problem here is not a want of historical evidence. As D.H. Van Dalen says, It is the theological or philosophical assumptions which are determining the conclusions in a case like this. So, to answer your final question, I think Crossan's views, though he uses the language of orthodoxy, are completely unorthodox, and really, he's an atheist.
When you read the account of Mark's passion, you
Yes.
stopped right before Mark's account of the appearances of Jesus. It's been theorized and taught at this school that that appearance section of Mark was later added.
Right.
That the early manuscripts of Mark don't have it included.
Correct.
And I was wondering how that affects the pre-Markan source and the validity of those accounts.
Well, you're quite correct, and your professors are correct in telling you that, and that's why I didn't read the rest, because that's not part of the original source. It's not part of the original manuscript. So it doesn't affect the original manuscript in any way. It just means that later on, people took the other Gospels and compiled a sort of composite of the various appearance stories and tacked them on to the end of Mark's empty tomb story. But through textual criticism, we now know that those manuscripts were, as I say, later editions, and that the original pre-Markan, or the original Markan story, as well as the pre-Markan Passion source, simply ends with the empty tomb story. Now, the unresolved question is this: could there originally have been more to Mark's 16th chapter that has been lost? There's no manuscript evidence of this, but is it possible that, in fact, the original Gospel of Mark did have some appearance narratives in it, but that these were somehow lost before copies could be made, or something of that sort? There are some scholars who think so. But I think probably most scholars would say, in the absence of any evidence for that, that's just conjecture, and therefore we should assume that Mark simply ends with verse 8.
First of all, thank you for an incredibly lucid presentation, that was thrilling. I'm curious about something, because I've never heard anybody teach on this, but I wonder how people in the Sanhedrin, members of the Sanhedrin at the time of Christ, might have interpreted or thought about passages in the Old Testament such as, "Thou shalt not leave a soul in hell, neither shalt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption," especially the word corruption. Just curious, because I've never heard a teaching on it.
Right.
As I think about it, and after your presentation, it really, comes a question for me. I mean, think of all the times you sat in Sunday school and in church, and I've never heard that at all.
This is related to my point that I made a couple of times, that there aren't in the Old Testament these clear motifs or anticipations of the resurrection of Jesus that would lead a first century Jew with no knowledge of the resurrection to think that on the basis of the Old Testament Jesus would be risen from the dead. These passages, like Psalm 16:10 that you quote, or Jonah being in the whale for 3 days and 3 nights and then belched out on the land alive, or Hosea 6:2, where it says, "After 3 days he will raise us up," can only be seen as anticipatory of Jesus' resurrection when viewed in hindsight. It's only after the resurrection occurs that the early Christians can then go back to the Old Testament with that in mind, looking for verses that then can be interpreted in that light. But when read by Jews prior to the resurrection, no one would have read those passages as predicting resurrection of the Messiah or anything of that sort. So that's one of the strengths, I think, of the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, is that it's something that's so unexpected, so un-Jewish, that it can't be plausibly explained as concocted or inferred on the basis of these Old Testament motifs. And even, as I say, someone like Crossan recognizes that. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I was wondering, it's also a question just out of curiosity, if there would be some reference or text you would recommend on the would-be messiahs that came before Christ shortly in that time, so that I can better understand what was going on.
Well, I think you might take a look at N.T. Wright's book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. Wright's book is this massive 800-page study of the resurrection that came out just last summer. It's the most thorough historical examination of this topic in English, well, really in any language now. And in there, he will give references to these messianic movements that occur in the century before and after Jesus and compare them with the Jesus movement. Wright is especially strong on this. In fact, I think his whole book can be seen as the most developed account of my third point, namely the very origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. Wright's book, I think, is really the most thorough examination of that question. How did these early Jews come to believe something like that God had raised Jesus from the dead, so completely contrary to the religion in which they had been raised and the beliefs that they accepted? And there you'll get a lot of these references and primary sources actually quoted right there. So look at N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, for some of those sources.
I want to just make a little comment myself here, and that is, you said to first century Jews, the interpretation of these Old Testament passages, it's still to 20th century Jews the same thing. We had a dialogue with our church and B'nai B'rith and on the book of Isaiah, and they see only the first level, the first layer of Isaiah, that it was for those people at that time, and don't see all the enriching layers that we look back using the resurrection.
Right.
So 20 centuries of Jews still believe the same thing.
Yeah, okay.
This question is regarding your third point.
Yes.
I just want to throw out a hypothesis that I personally don't believe in, but it's a possible objection that could be raised. Now, true, there was no Christian belief that could serve as a template for the subsequent belief in the resurrection, but what about the idea that a possibility that the growing body of beliefs that were, based on Jesus' teaching while he was on earth, and for example, like I'm thinking of the account in John 11, where Jesus raised Lazarus, and the sister of Lazarus expresses the Jewish belief, when he says, your brother will rise. Well, I believe that he will rise at the last day.
Right.
But he raises Lazarus, Jesus raises Lazarus there in history. So couldn't that event serve as sort of a precedent that to change their conceptual framework? Well, maybe Jesus has.
Okay, this is a very good question. I'm glad you've raised it, because it's important to see the distinction between what happened to Lazarus and what happened to Jesus. Remember the quotation from Joachim Jeremias that I read, where he said there's nothing parallel to the resurrection of Jesus in late Judaic literature. He says, certainly revivifications of the dead were known, but these always concerned a return to the earthly life. Lazarus, you see, would die again. The daughter of Jairus that Jesus raised from the dead would die again. The widow of Nain's son would die again. In the case of the resurrection of Jesus, what you have is a resurrection to glory and immortality in advance of the end of the world, within history. So that these mere revivifications are not, in Jewish thinking, the same thing as a bona fide resurrection from the dead to glory and immortality. And so they don't actually offer parallels or anticipations of Jesus' resurrection. But the second thing, ironically, that needs to be said is that most New Testament historians would be rather skeptical of the historicity of Lazarus' resurrection. You see, it's only in the Gospel of John, which is one of the later Gospels, and so you're playing scholarly pick and choose if you deny the resurrection of Jesus but believe in the revivification of Lazarus, because then you're accepting an event that is less well attested while rejecting an event which is better attested. So that's part of the problem here. You can't have it both ways. If you're going to accept the evidence for the resurrection of Lazarus, then you've got to accept the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, because the evidence for the latter is so much stronger than the evidence for the former.
Question back here.
I'd like to get your take on the Jesus Seminar. This seems to have been the impetus behind a lot of these specials on the last days of Jesus, the rise of Christianity, and so on. These guys seem to have really good PR, but how do they fit into the grand scheme of theology, both in America and Europe? Who are these guys?
Okay, thank you very much for that question as well. The Jesus Seminar represents the radical left-wing fringe of contemporary New Testament scholars. They claim to have about 200 members. Now that in itself alone would be small, because the annual attendance at, say, the Society of Biblical Literature convention each year is around 8,000 to 10,000. And the Jesus Seminar claims 200 members, but in fact, even those 200 members, when you look at it more closely, includes anybody that in any way has a connection with the seminar, such as even being on a mailing list. Most of the members of the seminar have relatively poor credentials. They teach at community colleges or junior colleges. Some of them have published nothing in the field of New Testament studies. There are probably about 14 of them that would represent really good first-rate New Testament scholars. People like Crossan, Funk, Borg, and some of the others. But the viewpoints that they represent do represent a very radical fringe element which is rejected by the majority of New Testament scholars that would meet at, for example, the Society of Biblical Literature meeting. In addition to that, I would say that they are honest, at least, about their presuppositions. In their edition of the 5 Gospels, they state some of their presuppositions, and they state the number one presupposition underlying their work is scientific naturalism. That is to say that miracles are impossible. They say that it is no longer possible to believe in the Christ of creed and dogma once you have seen the heavens through Galileo's telescope. So the whole thing, again, is built into the philosophical presuppositions that miracles are impossible and that a supernatural Christ is out of the question, and therefore naturally you wind up with this human view of Jesus who never made any radical claims, didn't anticipate the coming of the kingdom of God in his person, or any of those things that most critical scholars would affirm about him. If you'd like to see a good critique of the Jesus Seminar, let me mention 2 books. One is a book by Luke Timothy Johnson, who is a New Testament scholar at Emory University, who is not himself an evangelical or a conservative. He would be a kind of middle-of-the-road, moderate, sort of mainstream New Testament scholar. And this book, The Real Jesus, is a caustic denunciation of the Jesus Seminar and their claim to speak as the voice of scholarship. He just really rakes them over the coals. He says the whole thing is motivated by a kind of social agenda on the part of Robert Funk, the founder of the seminar, to undermine the view of Jesus that is prevalent in our culture and replace it with this more politically correct, humanistic Jesus that the Jesus Seminar wants to have. And he sees it basically as not disinterested scholarship, but as an overtly social agenda-driven movement. So that's The Real Jesus by Luke Timothy Johnson. For a more conservative critique, from a conservative end, you might look at the book Jesus Under Fire, edited by J.P. Moreland and Michael Wilkins. And it has a wonderful collection of essays from various scholars on things like what did Jesus say, what did Jesus do. There's an opening chapter on your question, who is the Jesus Seminar, who are these men that are in it. I have a chapter in there on John Dominic Crossan and the resurrection of Jesus, where I go into more detail about some of the things I've said here. And it's very fine critique, I think, of the Jesus Seminar. So those would be 2 resources if you're interested.
Question here.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Craig. Now, you started your presentation today by saying, how we are to understand Jesus Christ, we must look at what happened after the resurrection. So when you read the Gospels also, we see a lot of stories of Christ's life before his crucifixion. But when it comes, after the resurrection, we don't see much,
Right.
written text about that. and they seem to almost end abruptly, as Gibson's movie did after the when he was resurrected.
Right.
Seems like there's and you presented all this right now. Why don't we see much things written about the Christ's last days in that sense? And what did he do? What do we know?
Yeah.
And you presented, did he go? I mean, do we have any books or any texts or anything like that?
Yeah.
And why is that such?
Well,
little
let
written?
me first make a slight correction in what you said in your question. What I said in my opening statement was that what is key to unlocking Jesus' identity is what happened to him after his death, not after his resurrection. That is, what happened to him after his death. That is to say, that he was raised from the dead, I think is, as Pannenberg said, the divine vindication of the man who had been crucified as a blasphemer. And it shows that he was not a blasphemer after all, that the God he had allegedly blasphemed has committed himself to Jesus and has vindicated him over his enemies. And that, I think, is enough to show that Jesus was who he claimed to be and to put a sort of divine imprimatur on Jesus' teachings and personal claims. But in addition to that, I guess I don't feel like we have so little about Jesus after his death. When you read the various resurrection appearance stories in the Gospels, because you have a rather lengthy series of appearances that are described there. You get a good idea of what Jesus' body was like in its glorified form. So when you think about the resurrection, this isn't something that you would anticipate having a whole lot of information about to begin with. So I guess my reaction is rather one of surprise that we would have so much information about this. I suppose the reason that we don't have more would be that the very nature of the resurrection appearances were that they were transitory in nature. It wasn't as though Jesus came back and then abode with his disciples in the former way that he abode with them, but rather he would appear during a brief interval and then it would be over. And so these appearances, I think, had a kind of mystical and numinous quality about them that made them mysterious, maybe even a little hair-raising, especially at first. And therefore they are, by their very nature, transitory, brief, and so forth, rather than having a kind of extended narrative as though Jesus were staying with them. Luke says that these resurrection appearances continued over a period of about 40 days. But they weren't continuous during those 40 days. That would be a 40-day period that would be punctuated by these appearances. So I guess I think that by the nature of the case, one wouldn't have an extended narrative, and it's rather remarkable that we do have what we do.
Question back over here.
Yes.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could respond to the Muslim belief that Jesus actually wasn't crucified at all, that
Yes.
God made it appear to be the case, and therefore his resurrection appearances would not actually be resurrection appearances.
Yes. In my theological work at the University of Munich, although I wrote on the resurrection of Jesus, my side area of expertise on which I was examined was Islam. And I never dreamt that this would be something on which I would be speaking someday, but in the aftermath of 9/11 and our heightened awareness of Islam in the world, I've been called upon more and more to address these kinds of questions. And so I welcome this question as a very interesting one. In my dialogue with Muslim theologians, when I've had events on university campuses with them, this is one of the points that I press them very hard on. Because the crucifixion of Jesus is, in the words of Robert Funk, the founder of the Jesus Seminar, the one indisputable fact about Jesus of Nazareth that everybody recognizes. And so I find it ironic that of all the facts that the Quran or that Muhammad would have denied about Jesus would be the one indisputable fact that everybody recognizes about Jesus of Nazareth, namely that he was executed by crucifixion. And the reasons for that is that we have a multitude of sources, independent sources in the New Testament that attest to this. We have extra biblical sources in Tacitus and Josephus that attest to this. Also, it passes the criterion of embarrassment. That is to say, it is something that the early church would never have invented for its would-be Messiah, had it not in fact been true. It was something the early church had to overcome rather than invent. So there are very, very good grounds historically for believing that Jesus was executed by Roman crucifixion. And yet the Quran denies this without a shred of historical ground for doing so. The Quran was written by a man 600 years after the event who had no independent source of historical information about Jesus of Nazareth, who simply received and codified in the Quran tales of Jesus that were found in the apocryphal Gospels, like the infancy Gospel of Thomas, as well as in the New Testament, or that were just circulated in the Arabian Peninsula. And so the Quran contains at its heart an egregious historical error, namely that Jesus of Nazareth was not crucified. And in my debates with Muslim theologians on this, perhaps the most interesting response that I've received so far was the claim by Shabir Ali, who is a Canadian Muslim apologist. He is willing to agree that Jesus was in fact crucified, which really compromises the Quran, because the Quran says they did not crucify him. But Ali is willing to grant that he was crucified, but he says he wasn't actually killed. Ali subscribes to the apparent death theory, and he thinks that they took him down alive from the cross, placed him in the tomb, and before he could die in the tomb, Allah assumed him into heaven. So he will go, like 90% of the way toward the Christian view, but then at the last minute, he has a sort of body-snatching view of Jesus where God takes him away. I pointed out to Shabir in the debate that what this means is that Allah then deceived 1/3 of the world's population by foisting Christianity upon the world, by snatching away the body of Jesus so the disciples would find the empty tomb, see these appearances and think he's risen from the dead, and thereby Allah has deceived most of the world into believing in Christianity, which is surely implausible. And he didn't have a good response to that. So I think this is a really major problem for the Quran, is its historical portrait of Jesus is so fundamentally at its heart inaccurate.
Another question back here.
Yeah, although we don't have many stories or accounts of post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, there is one account of his meeting with his disciples on the road to Emmaus. Could you take us on a walk down that road and give us a picture of what Jesus might have told them, connecting his death, his resurrection, his life, who he was, with the Old Testament?
All right, in this Emmaus Road story, we have a tale here of a very early appearance of Jesus. There are two persons, it may be a man and his wife, walking back to a village of Emmaus, which has not been positively identified, but was probably a village within 6 or 7 miles of Jerusalem. They're walking back to Emmaus, and all of a sudden, a stranger comes alongside and begins to walk with them. And he asks them why they look downcast and sad. And they say, "Haven't you heard what's happened?" And then they relate the passion story of Jesus and talk about how Jesus of Nazareth was a man attested by wonders and so forth. And many of us had hoped that he would be the Messiah. But now he's been put to death. And they're walking back dejected to Emmaus. But they say a very strange thing has happened. Some of the women visited his tomb and found it empty. And others went and checked out the women's report, but they didn't see him. And so they don't have any faith in his resurrection. And then the stranger begins to say to them, you're men of little faith, you're slow of heart to believe. And he begins to expound to them these Old Testament passages to show them that the Messiah would have to suffer and die in order to enter into his glory. And he probably unfolded scriptures like the one that was mentioned here, Psalm 16:10, Psalm 22, where the psalmist writes, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The very words that Jesus would pray on the cross, and describes the horrors of what sounds like crucifixion. He probably opened Isaiah 53 to these men and shared with them about the suffering servant predicted by Isaiah. and showed them how the Messiah, in fact, would have to suffer and die in order to be glorified. In other words, the stranger shows them that when read in retrospect, they could see, in fact, what they had not been anticipating or accustomed to see, namely this idea of a Messiah who would suffer and die. And they asked the stranger then to sup with them because the evening or the afternoon is far gone, and he agrees to do so. And as they sit at table, and he begins to break the bread and assumes the place of the household master by breaking the bread, it says suddenly the scales fall from their eyes and they recognize him. They recognize that it's Jesus. And as soon as they recognize him, he vanishes out of their sight. And they then grab their things, and that very same evening they rush back to Jerusalem, excited that they have seen him, and they find the 12 disciples gathered in the upper room, who in the meantime have heard from Peter that Peter has also seen Jesus alive. And they say, the Lord is risen indeed, he has appeared to Simon. And then the people from the Emmaus tell him what they have seen and experienced. And the story ends by them saying, didn't our hearts burn within us as he opened to us the scriptures and explained to us what the Christ would be like? And so this is a story of a resurrection appearances that is one of the most lovely in the Gospels, but also incorporates, I think, a lot of the lessons that the early church would learn about the person of Jesus and his identity as the Messiah and the suffering servant predicted by Isaiah.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.